welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. Today we have on Barry Maurer. He's on the cutting edge of research into cognitive immunity and the threats posed to it by the intersection of illiberal forces and electronic media. Barry's the author of Deadly Delusions, Right-Wing Death Cult, and The Cognitive Immune System, the mind's ability to dispel pathological beliefs. Barry collaborated on the DARPA-funded project Deep Agent, a framework for information spread and evolution in social networks. And Barry teaches symposiums on cognitive immunity, including the Age of Mass Delusion, Why Are People Fooled, and Propaganda and Pseudoscience. He's also part of the Mental Immunity Project and CIRCE, which aim to advance and apply the science of mental immunity to inoculate minds against misinformation. Barry, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And so in one of his articles, Barry wrote, and I really love this, and we're going to talk about why in a second, some bad ideas get past the mind's defenses and then hijack the mind's immune system. These bad ideas recruit the mind's defenses to protect themselves, even if that recruitment ends up hurting the mind that hosts it. This process is similar to what happens with metastatic cancer, which spreads from one location in the body to a distant one. Metastatic cancer flips elements of the body's immune system, recruiting them to defend tumors and attack the body. When bad ideas hijack the mind's immune system, these bad ideas become resistant to correction, and the mind becomes susceptible to more bad ideas. Bad ideas spread in the mind and can eventually take it over. So this is really interesting, and there's so many points that we could talk about it with respect to this. But the thing that, I think a lot of people who, let's say amateur, I guess, I don't know what you would call us, people who are sort of amateur scientists, right? So people who love science but aren't necessarily professionals in it. The way that we would think of evolution is that everything is pretty much adaptive, right? So to think that there's something that could spread in a way that's not just maladaptive but resembles cancer, and the mind would defend it, seems so counterintuitive, right? So can you talk a little bit about that and your understanding of why, well, first of all, why is cancer a pretty good model for mental immunity, or, the lack thereof? And then also, how is it that these bad ideas, how is it that the mind protects them like it would a tumor?
Right. Well, I was pretty familiar with the mental immunity model, and the most common analogy is to infection, right? That there's sort of like a foreign agent that spreads through different bodies, if it's biological, or through different minds, if it's, ideological. I had read an article in a science journal, and I don't remember now what it was, specifically the journal, but it was about metastatic cancer and essentially the shift in science's view of it. That for a long time, the view was attack the tumor, right? That the tumor grows, and then the idea is we have to shrink it. And, so everything is aimed at the tumor, all the weapons we have in medicine. The alternative view was that equally important, if not more important than focusing on the tumor, was focusing on the environment in which the tumor grows, right? So essentially, some people are more susceptible to cancers than others. Some parts of the body are more susceptible to cancers than others. So there was a scientist in the 1800s who brought this up, who asked, why doesn't cancer always spread to an adjoining area, right? If it starts in the hip, why doesn't it move down the leg? Why does it instead move to the lungs? And so he was asking, well, is there something more, conducive to the tumor spreading to the lungs? So that became known as the seed and soil hypothesis. So it was equally important to focus on the soil than on the seed. And then with, more understanding of the immune system and genetics and so on, they were able to look at specifically how parts of the immune system were recruited by the tumor to protect the tumor. And so, of course, some of the new treatments that come out of that are immune treatments for cancer, which have to do with maybe turning off the ability of the tumor to recruit the immune system against the body. Why do these things develop in the first place? I mean, I think usually the understanding of cancer is that cells have these kind of on-off switches, right? That at a certain point in your life, particularly in childhood or adolescence, cell replication is kind of, needs to happen rapidly, right? And other times in your life that has to shut down so that they don't keep reproducing endlessly, right? So it's a mistake. It's a mistake in the code, I would say, right? It's very complicated code we're dealing with in terms of cells. And I would say the same thing's true in the mind, that, that our ability to process information, to navigate a world that's very complicated, it's bound to not be perfect, right? So evolutionarily, right, we're always we're limited by our senses, and then we're limited by our capacity to process the complexities of the world. And our cells are the same way. Sometimes they go haywire. The fact is, probably most of us have some kind of cancer in our bodies most of the time, which is just those cells, they're not turning off when they should turn off, but our immune system recognizes it and shuts it down.
Wow.
When we actually have a medical problem is when, the cell flips the immune system, or when the tumor is able to run out of control. So the fact is, probably cancer is way more normal than we would assume it is. It's probably really in all of us.
And I suppose maybe the next question would be, what is, if we were to say this, this analogous, right? What is the tumor in our mind, so to speak? And then what's going on that that the mind kind of comes to defend this tumor, or rather ideology or infectious idea?
So to me, the tumor is denial. Like, that's the core tumor. The introduction of the tumor is some kind of denial. And the denial might be any kind of denial, right? So children, for example, are very vulnerable to shock and distress. And so their denial might be, my family's okay, when everything around them is telling them that it's not. And that's adaptive to a point, right? Like, a certain amount of denial is necessary to get us through sometimes some hard times. But if it persists, then that denial turns into delusion. And delusion is really when the denial is kind of dug in and has defenses, starts to develop defenses around it. So delusion is just denial on steroids. And so when we look at pathological beliefs, I would point to things like climate denial, right? Or I would actually call it climate delusion, because denial would be maybe the first time a brief moment when you sort of deny what's obvious, that the climate is changing, it's a result of human activity. And the delusion is once that's really settled in, and no amount of counter information or counter argument is going to break through. So then it's become like a tumor. And what's interesting about the spread of that is, apparently, what I've been reading in the literature is that people who admit to a certain amount of denial in their life or delusion, it starts to spread. So the delusion doesn't just contain itself to one thing, it starts to spread. And this is where you get conspiracism, right? So it's not just that that the climate isn't changing, or that, the humans aren't changing it or something like that. It's also that climate scientists are trying to, take over the political system. It's part of a conspiracy that the media is lying to us and so on. So in other words, the denial and the delusion start to spread and spread and spread, and there's no containment possible anymore to limit that.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a core set of beliefs. I mean, I've talked about this on other podcasts, obviously, so that I used to be a conspiracy theorist once upon a time. And I think there was a core kind of set of beliefs that informed everything else you believe. So if I had to kind of try to, reconstruct it now, I think one of the major ones was that you can't trust mainstream media. You can't trust the systems of power, any systems of power, religion, government, etc. So like none of them matter. You can't even necessarily trust people who are connected to those systems of power, even if they're like, pawns or whatever, like the kind of lower people on the rungs of the ladder. And the idea was essentially it was very much like in my mind, like living in the Soviet Union, where it's like everybody's kind of out for themselves and you kind of have to figure out how to navigate the world on your own. So a lot of it is based on paranoia. And I would argue that those kind of sets of paranoid beliefs, those core beliefs, they kind of end up informing everything else.
And you know what's funny about those beliefs? On the surface, they actually seem somewhat rational, right? Well, think about it. If for example, someone put out that belief, at least that, oh, well, people in power probably would like to maintain that power, and therefore they'll construct, or rather impose either certain systems, or rather put things into place that'll sort of keep them in that place of power,
like Machiavellian.
Right? So, on one level, you could look at that and say, okay, there's something rational about it. Like, oh, this makes sense to me. Right. Well, because this now makes sense to me, this sort of validates that belief. Like you're looking for rationalizations to sort of validate these existing beliefs. And Absolutely. It almost happens automatically, right? Because of that the root of your of the thought or belief.
Yeah, and Barry, and would you say that a lot of this stuff, because there is some semblance of truth, where like, how I mentioned the Soviet Union, the idea is that where you can look at systems of power who are corrupt and who misuse their power. Therefore, if you do have a paranoid mindset, it's much easier to latch onto those as confirmation bias.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, I was the same way. I was in high school, sort of exposed to libertarian anarchism, and my more of a left-wing one than a right-wing one, but sometimes I look back at it and I go, well, had some right-wing elements in it, unfortunately. But
like Chomsky, right?
Yeah, right, like Chomsky. And the thing is that I respect a lot of Chomsky's critique of media, and it's pretty accurate, but there are other. So this is where it gets really complicated, I think, is when you want to talk to people about this and how to discern what's true and what's not true, you kind of have to rely on experts, right? The do your own research thing doesn't really work unless you have a framework in which to do your research. So I'm an academic. To me, like the scholarly framework is the proper way to do research, where, you've got reliable sources, you've got checks and balances, all that kind of stuff. But so one can pick up a book by Chomsky and read it and say, oh, I completely understand the media and how it's structured in this way and that way. And what you've got is a pretty good perspective of media, but you would have to do more study and read other people who are also experts to get a more balanced view. And in particular, I'm thinking of someone like Jacques Ellul, who wrote about propaganda. But even Ellul has a kind of totalizing view of media. He even called it total propaganda. I mean, that was his. But it's quite a different model than Chomsky's model. So really what we have, if you do academic study around these kinds of things, we're not able to study everything in the media all the time. And so what we come up with are models. And our models are pretty good. And our models are better than not having models. And those models sometimes compete with each other. A model is never going to be identical with truth. but it's our best way of understanding truth. So, what I try to impress on people is just the complexity and the seriousness of the undertaking, right? And also in terms of the attitude that we go in with, there's a fine line between skeptical and cynical, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, it's hard even within a system that seems totalizing to understand that there are conflicting forces going on, right? Because it seems total, right? Like all the media is corporate propaganda.
Right.
Well, that's not entirely true. There are always contested, there are battles going on all the time within the media. Some of them are behind the scenes, some of them appear in public. There's never a unified front, right? Even within an organization like Fox News, there's not a unified front, right?
Yeah,
it's more complex than we would want to, picture it. So the difference is skepticism is where I'm paying attention to this complexity, and then cynicism is where I'm just going to paint it all with the same brush. It's all corrupt, ignore it all, throw it all out. Now, I would almost say that is entirely true of right-wing media. So maybe accuse me of cynicism, but, and I pay attention to right-wing media because I am interested in the conflicts going on within it. But it is largely a poisonous wasteland.
Right.
So, I think it's healthy to, I believe, have a general concept of this is in general a healthy system. This is in general an unhealthy system. So I would say of corporate media, in general, it's an unhealthy system. But there are still currents and forces within it that need to be, thought separately from just a blanket kind of condemnation.
Right. But, on some end, I think somebody might accuse you and they might say something along the lines of, well, but then who should the gatekeepers be? Okay, you're saying that one set of media are good or at least not bad. And then the other one are really like poisonous and evil. So, I mean, I'm sure you're not going to that extreme, but it's something along those lines. So how do we then make sense of who the gatekeeper should be? Because on the one hand, there's complete cynicism and they're saying, okay, we shouldn't trust experts. But then another person might say, well, okay, you're saying trust some experts, but not others. Let's just agree that Fox News are to some extent experts, right? So they'll say, okay, you're saying trust some experts but not others, but then how do you decide, and who gets to decide who the experts are? Who are the gatekeepers?
Good point. So I'm all about gatekeeping, and part of it is to recognize that gatekeeping is already a function in every institution that we participate in. And so the question is, what is good gatekeeping versus bad gatekeeping, right? I can almost point to Elon Musk and say that's the epitome of bad gatekeeping, right? Let's just flood the zone with Nazis and then censor anyone who disagrees with me, right? That's terrible gatekeeping. So we do have new institutions like social media where gatekeeping hasn't been invented or developed yet to the point where it should be, right? And if you look at the history of media, going back to the printed book, for example, the early history of the printed book is not a very good, it was not a particularly healthy media environment, because anyone who could afford to print a book could print total lies and propaganda and distortions and whatever and put it out. Mm-hmm. So certain kinds of gatekeeping practices, it wasn't necessarily who was the gatekeeper was it as important as certain gatekeeping practices were instituted. So for example, copyright, authorship, basically tells you who's responsible for putting this out, and who owns this property in a sense, so we haven't really come up with the new practices. This is why the electronic era we're in now is so dangerous, is because it's kind of like at a much higher, more risky scale of what happened in the early invention of print. And we know what happened in the early invention of print is you had the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and 150 years of brutal war and mass killing and insane propaganda on all sides. So we could kind of look at as well, like at the 20th century in the same way with radio, other sorts of mass media like film, right? And look at what the Nazis and what the Soviets did with this technology and what the Americans did too, right? That in a sense, the gatekeepers were either the state or they were corporations. And of course, my preference would be we make gatekeepers kind of like, to maybe more like in academia where we have, librarians sort of, they're the gatekeepers for what goes in the library and how that gets used, and scholars determine sort of like what gets taught in the classroom or what gets published as research and so on. So academia is a field where gatekeeping is very developed, and in other areas it's not as much, right? So I would say it's more practices than people. And then we've allowed certain institutions to just run out of control. And that was deliberate, right? We can look at the Telecommunications Act, for example, the late 1990s, and say that was a deliberate decision to turn all this new media over to the control of corporations, to let them do with it as they wish. So, we're reaping the consequences of that.
So I suppose in the age of social media, because we don't have really essentially any gatekeeping in place, or rather maybe we do. I mean, yeah, you could censor people for, I suppose hate speech or
people, they suspend accounts.
Sure, or misinformation, disinformation. However, so then I suppose, since mental immunity is sort of comprised of or rather like having a good mental immunity is comprised of having or rather it goes between there's the combo of internal and external cognitive barriers, right? So normally when we're talking about academia, right, an external barrier would include, like, let's say these gatekeepers, like peer-reviewed journals or articles. There's a system in place where you can actually get reliable information, right, and be able to sort of research that, and then maybe not even put the onus of the research necessarily on yourself. You can refer to experts in that field, right? Generally speaking. But I suppose in regards to social media, I mean, the onus is kind of on us, right? And our belief assessment tools. And those are the things that I suppose at the moment, because the onus is on us, we have to really, as a society, really essentially develop those belief assessment tools, right?
Because it's so saturated.
Yeah. So I'm definitely I guess a little bit odd man out in the mental immunity community, in the sense that I do believe that personal responsibility for mental immunity is important, but it's not nearly as important or nearly as effective as institutional responsibility for mental immunity, right? And I'll point out that the internet is an institution, right? It is there is a committee, I forget the name of it, that's sort of like responsible for the internet. And we don't normally hear about them because they don't hardly do anything. But the point is that's a decision too, right? To sort of just let things go. But that's almost like, saying, well, let's just let anything whatsoever get into our water supply, right? That's not a good idea. I've published on censorship a few times, and also I would say, having been a sort of Chomskyan, coming out of that tradition where I was a free speech absolutist, if you could call
Oh, I would
Yeah.
love to talk about that. Okay,
Yeah. I flipped almost completely 180. And so partly my point is that there's always censorship, right? And censorship is internal as well as external. And it's institutionally based in the sense that you generally know when you're in a situation, say at work, or say in your family or whatever, when you're going to say something that is going to be frowned on or discouraged, right? Which isn't to say you should never speak up and you should never speak your mind and you shouldn't take chances to get the heat if you really feel that's necessary. But that what you're recognizing in that moment is that there is a boundary, and that boundary is either codified or it's in some formal way as a policy, or it's informal, and that we have all kinds of things like Trump, for example, right now is claiming free speech in relation to the January 6th stuff and the attempt to subvert the election. And the prosecutor is saying this is nothing to do with free speech. This is acts, right? In other words, you can engage in a conspiracy to do something illegal in which your only act is speech, right? And yet that speech is illegal. It's in the furtherance of an illegal end. And so we already sort of, we say Congress shall make no law respecting freedom of speech, but the fact is we have all kinds of laws respecting the freedom of speech. Like you can't commit perjury, that's speech. There's
can't tell somebody you'll kill them.
You can't, yeah, I mean, you shouldn't be able to, although it's extremely common now that that goes unpunished, but that should be punished. So here's sort of where I come down is I noticed that in the 1950s or 60s, maybe 70s, there was some changes in free speech. Two that I noticed particularly, and one was affirmative and one was negative. The affirmative one was that no smoking signs went up all over the place. Okay, in other words, speech is mandated in places of business, right? That the government can say you must include this speech, whether you agree with it or not, right? This speech must be in this place. The other is that you had to take down signs that said whites only. Okay. And I think generally, like if we ask people, is it good that we have no smoking signs up? Is it good that we take whites only signs down? People would say yes, because the externalities or the costs of not doing those things is too high. And so we regulate speech around certain kinds of things where we recognize that the costs are too high. And this comes back to the whole point that you quoted from at the beginning of this conversation, which is that the tumor is unlikely to spread to an environment that is hostile to it, right? And so controlling speech has to be seen in terms of creating environments where pathological beliefs grow or they're resisted. And so, for example, in the town nearest to me here, the town is full of rainbow imagery. So like the crosswalks are rainbow, like rainbow flags, Now, that's not an openly hostile sign, yet it does create an unwelcoming environment for homophobia, right? And so we can create environments that are hostile to pathological beliefs, just like we want to create environments in the body that are hostile to tumors through affirming signs, right? And the other point I want to make is this doesn't necessarily mean that there's not going to be homophobia. This isn't going to cure homophobia, right? Just having rainbow flags everywhere. It suppresses it.
Right.
And I would say this is what we do with cancer all the time. Like if our body's working correctly, if our immune system's working correctly, we're suppressing cancer because it comes up all the time. If a society is working correctly, it's suppressing fascism, homophobia, racism, xenophobia, all those things. If it's not, it's letting tumors grow and spread.
Yeah, so I want to now get into free speech absolutism. So here's the interesting thing that I think kind of comes up in this argument. So oftentimes when you think about free speech, I think for the most part, free speech advocates are terrified of gatekeeping, because I think the thinking is, okay, if like, let's say some set or some group gets to decide of pretty much that they're the gatekeepers and who gatekeeps, they're going to suppress speech that maybe I'd want to talk about. So a lot of times, like, let's say, let me see, guys, I want to phrase this in a way that's as respectful as possible, because I really love, like because I want to talk about Michael Shermer. So I love Michael Shermer. So Michael Shermer's, and we've had him on the show multiple times, and we're really grateful for that. With Michael Shermer, the thinking is that if you're talking about, so Michael Shermer is really against wokeness, which I'm obviously not. So Michael Shermer's fear is that, okay, well, here's sort of on the far left, what he thinks is the fringes, even though it's definitely not. People are going to sort of start suppressing things that I believe, right? So he's really into pretty much banning transgender athletes in certain sports. And I think the idea is like, oh, okay, if like, we sort of silence free speech, what's going to happen if this particular pet cause of mine gets overlooked, right? So his idea is, okay, now we're going to just battle bad ideas with good ideas, right? It's this understanding that anything should be up for debate and everything should be up for scrutiny. And then essentially we could just like kind of work it out some way, right? If we just sort of talk it out in some public forum, eventually things will work out and we don't have to actually silence free speech. So that's a way to kind of bypass the argument altogether. So free speech absolutists would say, well, we're all pretty rational. And Shermer hates when people would, let's say, talk down to either, not necessarily him, but people who might either agree with him, people who are against free speech. So they would talk about infantilizing, So Shermer would say, okay, how is it fair that you're infantilizing a set of people and saying, well, you can't handle the truth? And there's some rationale to that. It makes a lot of sense. But the thing is, okay, but then where do we end, right? So, okay, so Shermer would say, well, we never end, right? So every idea should be out in the out in the public forum, and then nobody should be infantilized. But my thinking is that really true though? Can we say that, okay, so like Nazi ideas should be allowed to proliferate because people are just able to make up their minds? So, okay, so, kind of going back to you, Barry, what would your stance be in this respect in terms of free speech absolutism? Can we beat bad ideas all the time with good ideas? Or in this case, should the environment sort of rein them in a little bit more?
Yeah. No, I'm really opposed to that position. And my answer is somewhat complex, which is that I look to kind of ancient understandings, like ancient Greek understandings of different discourse arenas, right? So that there's one arena called forensics, which is discovering what the truth is, okay? And there are certain methods developed for discovering what the truth is, right? And so, we might say that like fingerprints are a form of forensic, a method of forensic knowledge. And, once there's a sort of consensus around that, debating it all the time doesn't make sense. Like, because then you get into these arguments like, how do we know the earth is old or not flat or something like that? It's because, well, to a certain extent, we have to trust our forensic, the forensic methods that have been developed so far, which have been reliable for hundreds of years, thousands of years, right? And the next is dialectic. So dialectic is to, submit a belief to scrutiny, okay? And again, there's methods that have been tried for hundreds of years, thousands of years to do that. There's the confusion about speech is to think that it's all the same, right? What people are mostly talking about when they say speech is they're referring to either rhetoric or which is, another level beyond dialectic. That's the question then of sharing what you learned in forensics and dialectics. And another one, which is blanking on the term, it's a Greek term. It means basically the battlefield of ideas. So, within rhetoric, you have different traditions. For example, there's a tradition of dialogue. A dialogue is a respectful exchange of information in which people are willing to change their beliefs based on a preponderance of evidence, maybe what Andy Norman would call, the reasons fulcrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that requires people to sort of have an environment of trust, a willingness, and a certain familiarity with the processes of dialogue. What we have in our media and social media and mass media is, I remember the term now, heuristics, E-R-I-S-T-I-C-S. So heuristics means battle, and it's a substitute for physical battle, right? So the point is to dominate and to disarm and defeat your opponents. Doesn't matter if you're right. And so we're in an environment where heuristics is what people think when they say speech. This is what they think of as heuristics, right? We're going to have a battle,
right?
To
So
me,
it's in bad faith, I think, is what you're saying a lot of times.
Well, a lot of the time, I mean, you can enter heuristics with good faith, but the point is you might be defeated by someone who's bad faith. But the point is that what's really important to have a healthy society are these other things, right? It's forensics, dialectic, it's rhetoric, it's dialogue. And if you put all your eggs in heuristics and ignore the other stuff, you're going to get a really sick society.
Right.
And this is not the way to settle most questions, is through heuristics, right? Most important questions are not settled through heuristics.
No.
And so how do you train or develop people's faculties in these other things? Now, the other thing I want to say is I do believe that there can be room for free speech absolutism, but it has to be in a very contained space. And I would put it this way. If you're working with biological pathogens, you want to do it in a lab where there's safety precautions, safety equipment, and training and all that kind of stuff, right? Same thing with pathological ideas. Yes, we should be able to look at them. Yes, we should be able to talk about them, but it should be in a very, special place where we can do it safely. And here's the thing about woke, quote unquote, is I don't think woke is against that, right? I think I would consider myself woke, and I refer to the term. It was introduced by Leadbelly, the blues and folk artist in the 1930s, and he used the term as in a message to Black people who were traveling through the South. He said, "Stay woke because there's lynchings going on." Right? And he literally followed up. He said, "Keep your eyes open." Okay, so to be woke just means to be alert, and in particular means to be alert to social injustice. So there's nothing inherently anti-woke in looking at Nazi literature and looking at, say, Nazi message boards or something like that, but in a space that's like a laboratory where that stuff can be treated properly, where you're wearing gloves and you're, essentially you've got your suit on. That you can look at the stuff. You can bring in an actual Nazi and have them talk, whatever, but it has to be that kind of space where it's safe enough to deal with this material so that it doesn't sort of escape and proliferate.
Right.
That's what I would say. So, yeah. So that's my complex answer to the speech question.
No, this is something that essentially, right, if you allowed anything to be said, especially on a mass scale, I mean, the consequences could be disastrous, right? I mean, especially in this age where, oh, if a piece of information becomes, quote unquote viral, right, gets to enough people, ideas can spread like wildfire. That's
Right.
always been the case,
Yeah.
that ideas spread like wildfire, but now more so, right?
Yeah.
So there has to be some sort of a top-down kind of approach to how these ideas proliferate, right? And then in regards to, there being a place or a lab, so to speak, where people can maybe have discourse on certain pathological ideas or just alternative ideas, I suppose. Yeah, there's something cool. We've talked about it on the show before too. Like, there were these debates hosted by I forgot the full name of this institution, but Pangburn. It's not Pangburn Classics. I always get them confused.
It's not
with
Penguin
Yeah,
Classics.
exactly. But no, but they had, like, for example, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, other figures, from the intellectual dark web, whatever. But the idea is, what they would do is they would employ this technique. We'll call it steel manning, right? Where essentially, you would state what you believe is the other person's perspective that you disagree with, and essentially strengthen their argument, or at least show understanding of their argument. They would do the same thing back with you, and then there's sort of back and forth until at the end there's, not always, but at least some sort of integration of ideas at the end, right? And
Yeah,
yeah,
can I
something like
can I just really want to quickly, I want to add on to that. So to give Michael Shermer some credit, this is something I wanted to say before. So he actually has kind of recanted and gone back on his stance on RFK at the very least, where he says, okay, well, technically he's never really willing to say he's wrong. He's not really looking at the evidence. So a lot of times his debating him does seem really pointless. And so, now kind of piggybacking on what we're talking about. So, I mean, Barry, based on like what Alan is saying, what do you think of that idea of debating somebody who, these people on these two extreme ends, when, let's say, when even Michael Shermer would admit, like, okay, yeah, RFK is never going to change his mind. So, I mean, does that matter then, that like one person isn't going to change their mind? Should we only really focus on the audience with these types of debates? Should we even have them at all?
there's also the platforming issue.
Yeah.
It's very complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. No, and I think platforming is a really important thing, that, it's platforms are important and should be protected. And it's very easy to debase them. Look at what happened recently with CNN, where they had a town hall with Trump, and that debased their platform to such an extent that, the CEO, or whoever the guy was in charge of programming, lost his job, and their ratings fell off a cliff. And rightly so. They polluted their platform. And partly it wasn't just that they gave Trump a platform, it was that they stocked the audience with, fanatical Trump supporters. And it was seen as like a rally that they basically put on for free, in which he just got to beat up on the interviewer. And so again, it wasn't treated at all with respect. The platform was disrespected. And so, we have to protect our institutions from debasement in the same way that we would protect our water supply from pollution. And again, that doesn't mean we're not going to look at pollutants, but we don't want to look at them coming through our water supply. That's not the proper way to look at them. So platforms are extremely important. And platforming, which is essentially the, pressure to deny certain people a platform, I see that as an entirely legitimate undertaking. I've seen many times, like, universities destroy their reputations by putting totally, toxic material on their stage, and what they're doing is they're giving legitimacy to it.
Right.
And so the whole question of legitimizing and so on, it goes back to that point I made before about, are we creating an environment that's conducive or hostile to pathological entities? And we're responsible for that. We're absolutely responsible for that. Yeah.
And I think if you were to sort of respond to Michael Shermer, I think the understanding here is that it's not so much that we're, or not we, whoever, right? Whomever is being infantilized, it's more like we can't really trust certain environments to allow the spread of ideas in a way that's conducive to overall health. So when Michael Shermer might say, well, it's probably easy just to like beat a bad idea. And I guess from your perspective, you would say, well, it depends the context. It depends on where you're talking about, right? So if let's say we have, so the Ken Ham and Bill Nye debate is something we've talked about multiple times. I'll bring it up again because it's, I think, a great point. So it really depends on where you're listening. So I'm assuming most people who are listening in New York will probably say, yeah, obviously Bill Nye won. I mean, it's clear. But then if you take that debate and put it in like rural Kansas, most people would say, oh my God, Ken Ham killed him. This is terrible. So I think it's a very simplistic understanding to say that we're just infantilizing people. I guess your response would be no, because the environments matter. So it's not so much that we're infantilizing people. It's just in some environments, they haven't been inoculated against bad ideas. Therefore, if we put those, you legitimize a platform, those ideas would maybe not necessarily spread because they're already there, but at the very least, they'll be reinforced.
Yeah. I actually have a sort of this is a very underdeveloped idea. I thought this up a long time ago. I haven't thought about it since, but this conversation sort of reminding me of this. So Barry, what do you think about this idea? And Leon too, why not? So
thanks. Why not?
Why not? No, so what if, for example, so like for example, Tucker Carlson, let's say, I know he's not on Fox News anymore, but for example, on essentially a news platform, which should just be about, just giving facts about things that occurred in the world or in your local area or in the United States rather, he would also espouse opinions along with those
lots
facts
of
or
opinions.
pieces of information.
Yeah.
What if it was regulated that on news networks, you're only allowed to just give facts or just information, no opinion attached to the information? That could be interesting because then you can't necessarily, it wouldn't be about swaying an audience to any particular side or point of view. It's just about just saying, this is what happened today or
like the
recently,
local news, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, definitely I'm old enough to have grown up in the pre-cable environment where there were essentially three stations, period. ABC, CBS, and NBC, and then PBS. And news was essentially identical on all of them. I mean, if you change the channel to a different station, you were going to get a consensus view of reality,
Right.
and not a lot of opinion. I mean, when opinion happened, it was big news. Like, when I don't know, like when it was opinion in the news that sort of brought down Nixon, that sort of brought down McCarthy, when the news people said, look, I can't just report on this as fact anymore. This is just appalling, and I think they were in their right to say that. But I also think, and it is fair to point to the consensus at the time and say there were pathological elements to the consensus, right? I mean, there was a sort of like consensus around the Cold War and that America was a force for good in the world, that not that it didn't have elements of that, but that it ignored, the massacres and the things that and again, it was opinion that started to bring down the US involvement in Vietnam, that, up until that point, there really was consensus around American military action.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's the word I would use, is there are blind spots, right? And that it is fair if the opinion is developed in such a way that helps us understand our blind spots. But by and large, that's not the function of opinion, right? But by and large, the function of opinion is to create consensus within either, one camp or two separate camps. And this is, I guess, what we would call, in Ellul's terms, we would call integrative propaganda. So when we hear the term propaganda, we most think of agitative, right? Which is like, oh, Osama bin Laden is trying to convert me to, Al-Qaeda ideology. That would be, that's not my ideology, so that's definitely agitative. But the vast majority of what we experience in terms of propaganda is integrative. It's saying that, continue to believe what you believe. Continue to believe, for example, that American military adventurism is purely, for the benefit of the world or something. And sometimes it's necessary for opinion to challenge or provoke reaction to that consensus. So I'm not against opinion, I would say. I do think that opinion has its place even in news media, and that opinion should be guided by this principle of revealing, exposing, whatever you want to call it, our blind spots, not reinforcing positions of power for its own sake, right?
That's fair.
Yeah. So what's come up with that, since you mentioned Tucker Carlson? Oh yeah, and you did ask for my opinion. So what's so interesting is this has been the thing lately. So the rapper Ice Cube has really come under fire lately. So not only because he's been he was working with Trump while he was the president to kind of end mass incarceration, to work on pardoning obviously minorities. I mean, which is obviously a good thing. And he's gotten a lot of heat for it because obviously it's still Trump. And now he went on. I don't know if Tucker Carlson has a show. It's some social media platform that he uses. I don't think it's a show per se, but he went on his platform, right? And so Ice Cube's thing is like, yeah, well, it's just talking to people. So why would I not want to talk to you? And Tucker Carlson's like, yeah, you see, like, I'm not a bad guy. And Ice Cube's like, yeah, you're not a bad guy. So it's so interesting because so on the one hand, first of all, I like Ice Cube and I've been a fan of his. So it's sort of shitty. But then on the other hand, I can obviously also see why people really dislike him and now why they've also turned on him. But the thing with somebody like Ice Cube, and this is, I think, the problem, is I think Ice Cube doesn't, this is why on the one hand, so it's kind of interesting because I'm kind of dual-minded about it. On the one hand, I forgive Ice Cube because I'm like, I can see why mass incarceration is obviously an issue for you. I can see why working with Trump would have been important to you. But then on the other hand, when he's saying like, oh, well, Tucker Carlson is a nice guy. Rogan said that too. I forgot. I think it was Gad Saad. He was also on this podcast. He was like, yeah, Tucker Carlson's a nice guy. So I think it's stuff like that where they don't know enough about these people and they just end up meeting them. And they're like, oh, well, he was really nice to me. And, why shouldn't I talk to him? We just have different beliefs. And Ice Cube said that on the podcast, whatever. I don't know if he has a podcast, whatever it is, some show. So Ice Cube said this on the show too, where he was like, yeah, we just have different beliefs, so why shouldn't we be able to talk about them? But I think that the downside here is that for a lot of people first encountering Tucker Carlson through Ice Cube, I don't think they know what Tucker Carlson is actually about, because of course he's going to be nice to Ice Cube. He's a celebrity on his show. I mean, he's not going to like curse him out and tell him like, oh, I disagree with you and you're woke and your music is garbage, even though I bet you anything but Tucker Carlson thinks Ice Cube's music is garbage, which he's not going to obviously say on the show. So I think the danger here is bringing, so if you think about, we should maybe get into this territory, maybe not. If you think about like Q Anon, right? So the idea of save the children, it's like, yeah, obviously we should protect children from human trafficking, but just like with something like Tucker Carlson or whatever, there's some similarity here. And I'm not exactly saying Tucker Carlson is QAnon, but what I'm saying is that the similarity here is that it's an introduction to something that's sort of dipping people's feet into something that potentially gets worse and worse over time. So when Ice Cube introduces people to Tucker Carlson, on the surface, it's like, oh well, here's this guy with just different ideas, and then as you kind of look into him more and more, I think that fear is that maybe people will become radicalized. Which obviously, if you just tell them on the surface, like, okay, here's what Tucker Carlson is all about, just like with the Save the Children's campaign, oh, it's just a front for QAnon, maybe people will be like, oh wow, I'm not interested in that shit. So I think that would be the major problem, is that it sort of slowly indoctrinates people into something that, again, like people like Ice Cube wouldn't even necessarily know. And look, maybe if Ice Cube knew more about him, he would just say, oh my god, wow, why the fuck did I go on this guy's show? But again, that's, I think, the fear of the platform, because that little by little people are like, oh, this isn't so bad, that's not so bad, and then little by little they kind of get deeper and deeper into it.
Yeah. The word cooption comes to mind, and so being aware of the history and the practices of cooption over time, and partly I would say, do I think there was some revolutionary or progressive elements of, Ice Cube's music. Yes, I think you could pick those out, right? But do I think he as a person is a progressive or something like that? I wouldn't say that ever. And partly I think if you look at kind of the I'm blanking on the name, but Tupac, yeah, I was thinking Tupac. The sort of effort to recruit gangs into leftist politics, right, was a total failure.
Mm-hmm.
And we can look at Tupac as the example of that. And I'm not saying rap is compromised or hip hop music. I think that's different. But the kind of valorization of gangs, right, was always there in Ice Cube's music. And all of the kind of, violent, misogynistic, that kind of stuff was always there. So I'm not totally surprised at this recent development in his career. Plus, he's, a media star who has been in television and movies and all these kinds of things. And he doesn't live in the same environment that ordinary people do. He's not just Jenny from the block, I guess. J-Lo's line.
QB from the block.
yeah, right. You've spent 40 years now as a rich celebrity. And you come to rub shoulders with other people who are rich celebrities, and you're not in the same world. Again, what I would say is that's Cooption. That he was never, perfectly progressive figure, and I wouldn't expect him to be.
Yeah.
But that the atmosphere, the environment, to come back to that term, of sort of feeding and nurturing pathological beliefs has been there, through gang culture, through kind of, macho, misogynistic media culture, has been encouraged and so on. And the gateway between that and Trump is very wide open,
Yeah.
And so we have to be vigilant. Honestly, we have to be very careful. And the word that comes to my mind is prudence. And this is, comes again from kind of ancient Greek. They saw that as the highest virtue. So to be prudent meant to have a healthy goal and to not be distracted from that goal and to be wise about your steps along the way, right? So if your goal is just to make money or to influence people or, to be famous or whatever, well, that's not a prudent goal to begin with. And then any step along the way is going to be corrupted. If your goal is to improve life for yourself and other people, and then you're careful about the steps you take along the way, that's prudence.
Wow.
So,
yeah. Wait, so yeah, I love that. And so this is kind of what I'm caught between. And I love that we're talking about this and you're bringing it up. So, I mean, I love hip hop and I also love professional wrestling, two industries that are so, oh my God, so caught up in just, I mean, you name it, right? Misogyny, racism, sort of macho cultures, etc. And I mean, for a lot of us who grew up in these cultures, obviously we're going to love these genres. But the thinking here now is that we've had several people from these industries on the podcast. I mean, I still watch wrestling. I still listen to those people. But yeah, man, it's a tight line to kind of walk because now I see that a lot of people are still in that. So yeah, Trump supporters, right? Pro wrestling is full of Trump supporters, just like hip hop is full of Trump supporters. Like Lil Wayne is a Trump supporter, and all of these people that you're thinking, wait, you guys are supposed to represent the kind of disaffected and disenchanted masses, but then here you are supporting rich people. So I kind of now wonder, is there a way to even disconnect the two? Because I think you're right. I think when people do become rich and they do become celebrities, what they do is they essentially kind of disconnect from mass culture, and what becomes more important for them is essentially sustaining their status.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to get lost in a society that the society itself has the wrong goals, right? The society itself sets the goals of, personal wealth, domination, fame,
Right.
all those kinds of things. So to develop a kind of, holistic set of principles out of that, I mean, to me, it's nearly impossible, but there are elements. I mean, within hip hop, there are elements that can point you to that. So, I particularly like, the kind of trip hop stuff that was happening in the 90s, for example, that seemed to me to be much more, it was like they were really getting into jazz, and there were a lot more female singers, and there were a lot more, kind of thoughtful lyrics, and but the point here is that atmosphere is really important, and I think about this in relation to music and other kinds of arts. Atmosphere is the environment in which certain things thrive and other things are discouraged, right? And we have to think about politics as having this aesthetic component. And we ignore that because here's what people on the left ignore that. And what happens is people on the right are all about that. And so things like pro wrestling and race cars and, rodeos and all that kind
football.
Of stuff, football, all that kind of stuff ties aesthetics with politics. And the left doesn't hardly do that at all. And that's a mistake. That's a mistake because aesthetics and politics are incredibly important. I mean, Hitler realized that, Stalin realized that. And we need to focus on it.
I mean, I wasn't expecting to go this direction, but you could argue like Hollywood, like actors or anything like sort of tied to acting is sort of, liberals sort of have that sort of aesthetic in the arts, like in that direction, I suppose. But actually, that's not even what I was going to say. What I wanted to say so in terms of what we can do on a societal level, essentially, like if on one level, yes, it's important that we develop our belief assessment tools, right? That we do things like podcasts, hope they become viral. People learn about critical thinking, and hopefully this causes like ripple effects. And that's a beautiful thing if that can happen, right? But in terms of what we can do as a society, I'm wondering, so in terms of let's say gatekeeping social media, right? Okay, so that's definitely one thing. Now I was wondering what you think about this, and I know you're looking at the time, right? So
no, don't worry.
I'll
Just checking.
But so what if we've also talked about this on the show too? What if like so that we have these algorithms essentially on these social media sites that maximize for time on site. They'll keep showing you the same types of things that you like, and essentially you'll keep seeing those things. And it's sort of in terms of politics, at least, that creates an echo chamber, and then you don't get exposed to other levels of thought, right? I was wondering if maybe regulating the algorithms that are used in terms of social media sites might be one of those ways to sort of solve for this polarization issue on a societal level. I'm not sure to what degree, though, because I understand there's a marketing incentive to showing you the things that you like. Oh, dopamine builds up. Oh, I love this. I'm going to stay on this platform. Oh, all the advertisers are on this platform. This works for us as a company to, have these advertisers here and people looking at our stuff all the time. So I'm not sure what the balance would be to still have something that's good for society, but that seems like one direction to sort of go.
And how would prudence factor in?
So here's my thought about this: is that since really the age of mass media, which I would say begins with the printing press, and then certainly picks up over time with other technologies like photography, audio recording, you know, the airwaves and so forth. We've been living in an uncontrolled social experiment, right? We release this stuff into the wild. We allow essentially predatory actors to be in charge of it. And then we just see what happens. Okay. What happens with millions and billions of people when you just release this stuff? And, you know, the answer is a lot of bad shit happens, right?
Yeah.
You have genocides and all kinds of things that result from this uncontrolled social experiment. And that's why I think this medical model is really important. You know, I'm not arguing for a technocratic elite that's going to study all this stuff and decide what gets released and what doesn't. I would much rather have the society think about it as a whole, and think about what do we want, right? But the problem is you can't think about it once your mind has already been changed by the technology that you're using, right? That's like saying, you know, you're going to, you know, consult with heroin addicts about whether, you know, about drug policy when they're still in active addiction, right? It doesn't make sense, you know. And so partly what we need to do is allow ourselves to take a step back and have a position of assessment. And here's what I think that would look like, okay? I think that it should involve more education in which we train ordinary people how to be propagandists, how to be manipulators, how to use things like algorithms to, you know, to in an abusive way. And again, this has an ancient tradition to it, which in rhetoric, which is essentially, you know, gotten this reputation as a dark art, right? You had to practice rhetoric to learn the illicit or dark side of it, you know, so that you wouldn't be taken in by that, but also then you could make a distinction between that and the productive, you know, pro-social uses of rhetoric. I think the exact same thing is true of algorithms and of mass media, that we really need people to learn how to be manipulators of this stuff so that they can kind of look under the hood, see how it's made, see how it works, know then when they're being fooled, and know then the distinction between healthy and unhealthy uses of these tools. Because the tools themselves, again, like, you know, print, obviously, like you can have a print book that's absolutely wonderful and conducive to life, or you can have one that's, you know, totally destructive, like Mein Kampf or something. You know, print isn't inherently good or bad, but we have to learn sort of what it is and how it works. And the same thing with all this other media. So literacy, I would say, is very important, and we have to learn the dark arts. And that brings me to Harry Potter, right? Like that the Harry Potter thing is, you know, you have to learn not only the good magic, but the bad magic, you know? So.
No, I love that. I have a doubt that brings me to here then. I should ask this. Do you think that's happening now, at least on an amateur like level? Why I say that is because this is sort of influencer culture, right? It's actually quite popular. Like if you ask a lot of kids what they want to be in the future, well, I'm sorry, I can't quantify this. I don't have any metrics to support this. I'm sorry. It seems like a lot of people want to be influencers, and there are a lot of them, and people are trying to become
it's
famous.
a form of fame. Yeah.
And right, and make these videos and try to appeal to a mass audience, right? On some level, you could almost argue what you're suggesting is sort of happening now, just not in a, it's not structural. It's not like people are being taught explicitly, this is, you know, this is how you manipulate someone, or rather, you know, dark psychology or whatever you want to call it. But it is kind of happening, which is maybe hopeful, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I would see that more as sort of monkey see, monkey do, rather than a structured way of understanding the dark arts. So like, I guess there's show, I haven't really watched it yet, so I'll have to check it out, but How to Be a Cult Leader.
Oh, it's so good. I
Netflix,
just
yeah.
finished watching that. Yeah. So
Yeah.
good.
So, I mean, I think that kind of thing is perfect for helping people defend themselves or recognize, what's going on, which in no way means that someone watching that show couldn't then become a cult leader based on those lessons, right?
Right.
True.
But we are generally inoculating the society by and large by giving them that information. Um, Teaching people how the Nazis came to power, I think, wasn't just a spontaneous thing. It took years to sort of plant those ideas and I like the idea of, or the metaphor of uncovering rocks, right? So how did the Nazis really come to power? The answer is that they allowed things that had been suppressed to be released. So they uncovered the rocks and allowed the undergrowth of pathologies to grow up and produce monsters. So the argument there is that, well, the monsters are always there. They're always, we might say the monsters within, right? This is the horror movie analogy. But when a society is functioning well, when an individual person's functioning well, we suppress that. And it's just like those cancers that our body is suppressing all the time. And when we don't, they pop out, Pandora's box opens, and we're, in the situation we're in now, where things
And
are
I think
running amok. Yeah. So.
And I think the beauty with that information becoming a little bit more kind of viral, mainstream, whatever term you want to use, is even the title of that show, How to Become a Cult Leader. I think some people, probably very few people, will watch it and say, "Oh, great, I now can learn how to become a cult leader." But I think the vast majority of people who are watching it are going to be thinking, "Oh, great, this is how I immunize myself against cult leaders." So what's going to probably happen is, yes, you'll have more people who have that insight, but then on top of that, you'll have even more people who will be inoculated against somebody like that kind of coming to power, obviously taking advantage of them, etc. So I think the idea is, if we're talking about like net wins or losses, yeah, it's probably a net positive to have information like that out there.
Of course.
I would say, like, my most satisfying moments teaching, which are also some of the most disturbing moments I've had teaching, is when students have come up to me and said, "I'm in a cult."
Wow.
And that's happened probably half a dozen times. And they've made drastic life decisions based on what they're exposed to in class, which is precisely this, sort of like how to be a cult leader stuff. And some of them, said, define the cult as Jehovah's Witness or whatever, they're in, and they didn't recognize it until that moment. It's but the other thing that I think about is, oh my God, this is a lot of responsibility, right? If a person comes up and says this, it means their whole life is going to change. Right. And what have I done? There was one case where a woman in my class, she was Saudi, and she said, I've decided based on this class, I'm divorcing my husband.
Wow.
And I don't get in front of my class and say, you should divorce your husband, leave your family, whatever, leave your church. I just say, like, here's how manipulation works. And then people take it and they do these things with it. But this is going back to the first, early conversation about denial and delusion. This is why people have denial and delusion in the first place, is that making those decisions is painful and costly. There's no way to, get out of a marriage, even an abusive, horrible one, that I can think of that's not costly. Or to leave a cult, and to leave people you care about behind, or your identity, and so we choose denial because we want to avoid the suffering that goes with the recognition of a reality that we would prefer not to accept. And so, yeah, there's something very, and I guess I'm sure you've talked about IPC, identity protective cognition.
Oh, we haven't. No, what is that?
Oh, you haven't? Okay, so
I'm assuming this
On
is
some level,
yeah,
yes,
not
but
not
not that
exact, not that
explicit,
term. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So right. Essentially, you identify with your beliefs. Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's always there's always a kind of loss that is almost like a grief, like a death.
Yeah.
If you
Mhm.
have to, if you have to leave behind something you considered a core part of your identity, and so people will protect their identities. And it's weird what sorts of beliefs people consider to be core to their identities.
Mhm.
Sometimes it might just mean identification with some, pop singer or something is so core to my identity, I can't leave it behind. Fandom is one example, but people can be, have their identity around all kinds of, and it's not always unhealthy, right? I mean, sometimes having your identity be structured in such a way that, I mean, it's good to have mentors, right? It's good to have people you look up to, that you admire, that you trust.
Yeah.
But you have to recognize if you're being steered wrong, if you're being abused, if you're being misled, and then know that you've got to get out.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's very painful.
Yeah. Since you mentioned Tupac, actually, first of all, I love Tupac. But second of all, like it's such a great example too, because I think for a lot of people, they end up riding the fence where they don't really pick one set of values over the other. So the best example of like with Pac, I mean, he obviously, and this is obviously well known. This is not meant to be insulting in any way. A lot of his lyrics were garbage. I mean, he made a lot of misogynistic music. A lot of it was about sort of gangs. He actually got into gang culture later on in his life. I mean, this is all pretty much well known. But the thing is, there was always a fluctuation between that kind of militant mindset and of more community based, trying to help people, trying to figure out kind of what works or what's best for the community, uplifting, maybe spiritually uplifting, whatever kind of term you want to use. But I think the point with Pac was that he constantly vacillated back and forth between the two. And there's this movie about him called All Eyes on Me. And in the film, I don't know if this like really happened, but at least it was a part of the film. His mom in the movie, Afeni, she says they're going to give you all of the tools that you need to destroy yourself. And he kind of heard that, but didn't really take it seriously. And obviously, toward the end, that's exactly what happened. So what's interesting, I think, is that a lot of us do fluctuate between these two systems. And I would argue because of, what you're saying, Barry, is because of the environments that we're in. So Pac said this, and I love this quote, even though it's kind of horrendous and also incredibly sad. He said, and this was when he was on MTV, he did this interview where he was on Venice Beach, whatever. It was a really good long interview. And he was really in depth and he mentioned a lot about his life. And he said, look, man, you can't be an angel when you're living in hell. So, and the kind of interviewer at the time, she was kind of taken aback by it. She's like, wow, like, is that your life? Like, that's where you live? And he's like, yeah, it's very kind of Machiavellian. So I think for him, as much as he wanted to uplift people, again, he kind of vacillated back to fortune and fame because he realized, okay, if I'm going to do this, this kind of culture is going to eat me alive. So I don't know what the resolution to that is. I mean, it seems like environmental change is a big factor, but what?
Yeah, no, you just said it.
But
How can I be an angel in hell?
Right.
It's even there in the
Right.
quotes.
But I think what makes it so difficult is that, at least obviously in his lifetime, there was nothing about it that was going to change. So I don't know. I think, but my point was to say that I think a lot of people are stuck in that in between state where a lot of time, and we can even point to cultures where, let's say, I don't know, imagine if you are living somewhere in the deep South, and let's say you're the one person who isn't a racist, and then you're in an environment of people who are. Like, how do you kind of navigate that? I mean, you're not just going to move to, like, I don't know, LA or New York City, obviously. So I don't know.
And even if you were a social chameleon, how do you fit in?
Yeah.
Right, or whatever. That's a different conversation there, I suppose. But
I live in Florida, so
yeah, I can imagine.
And I think of Theodore Adorno here, who said, how do I stay healthy or sane in a sick society, right? And really the answer is you can't, because the environment is going to get you, because you're this big and the environment you're in is an ocean, right? And so the solution then is common cause, right? It's truly people working together to change their environment. And no one person can do it, right? And we do it primarily through our institutions. So I am really a big fan of, like, the movements, for example, of ex-gang members who are trying to help gang members get out of gangs. And similarly with right-wing extremists, like people who were in, Klan or Nazis or whatever, who formed groups to try to help others get out of these groups. And to me, this is kind of the embodiment of, like, we have to, yes, we're in a sick society. We can't get well on our own. We have to make common cause with others. We have to look at the darkest stuff imaginable, like, we're not dealing with angels at all here, right?
Yeah.
And yet the belief that I did it, you can do it, and we need to do it, is really powerful. Oftentimes when I talk to, like, a lot of people talk to me and say, someone in my family has gone down this dark rabbit hole, what should I do? And I often say, well, there's nothing you can do, really, because the only people who had any kind of could have any kind of input to them are people like them, right? And so that's why they might listen to someone like Derek Black, who converted from neo-Nazism to now anti-racism. You might listen to Derek Black when you're not going to listen to, say, I don't know, Ibram Kendi. You're not going to listen to him, but you might listen to Derek Black. So, and you might not listen to Derek Black. I mean, the thing is that partly the other point I wanted to make about this is that an ounce of prevention is sure worth a pound of cure. It's sure better to prevent people from going down rabbit holes than it is to try and get them out of one. Inoculation works before you encounter the pathogen, right? You can't get the vaccine for, I don't know, polio if you've got polio. It's
Right.
not going to cure you. So this whole idea of vaccination is only preventive. The cure stuff is mostly not going to work. If it is going to work, it's usually costly, long-term, painful, intrusive, deeply uncomfortable, and so on. So a lot of people concerned about these kind of questions, they keep asking me about cures, and I keep talking about prevention. So that's where we kind of,
Yeah.
It's not that I'm against looking at cures. I am for that, because it's very costly for anyone to continue down these rabbit holes. But
Yeah. Yeah. So, and the corollary here for psychotherapy or in psychotherapy would be that it's much easier to prevent trauma than it is to heal it. So I love that idea. And I feel like this is a kind of great spot to wrap it up on. All right, Alan, final questions for Barry before we go.
Absolutely. Barry, if you wanted to follow you and follow your work, where can we do that?
Well, probably the best place to look would be on either ResearchGate or academia, which is the places for people to share their published research and writing. And so most of my writing is freely available. You can just look up my name on either of those places. And if you look up my name, you'll also find out that I'm a musician and I've got some records out and some stuff like that. So you can check.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right, Barry. Thank you so much, man. This was excellent. One of my favorite shows of the year.
Oh, appreciate that. I really enjoyed doing this show. You guys are great.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Thanks. All right. Take care.
All right. So everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. On Twitter, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.